In the 1930s, Harlem was controlled by crime, money, and racial boundaries. The Italian Mafia expected obedience. Black gang leaders were tolerated but never respected. Then an Italian mobster crossed a line. He publicly insulted Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson using a racial slur. What followed did not lead to gunfire. It led to something far more unsettling for the Mafia. They backed down. Why? Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. His childhood was shaped by poverty and the violence of the Jim Crow South. When he was still young, his family moved north to Harlem during the Great Migration, seeking safety and opportunity. What they found was a neighborhood packed with promise and danger in equal measure. Harlem in the 1920s was becoming the cultural heart of Black America, but it was also becoming a battlefield for control of its illegal economy. Johnson earned the nickname Bumpy because of a large bump on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury. He was intelligent, observant, and unafraid. By his teenage years, he had already begun working for local criminals. He learned quickly. He understood that survival in Harlem required more than toughness. It required calculation. He needed to know who held power, how that power operated, and where the cracks in the system were. Harlem's underground economy in the 1920s and 30s was built largely on the numbers racket, an illegal lottery that allowed people to place small bets on a 3-digit number drawn daily. The odds were long, but the cost was low, and for working-class residents struggling through the Depression, it offered hope. The numbers game generated enormous cash flow, and control of that cash meant control of the neighborhood. One of the most important figures in Harlem's numbers operation was Stephanie Street Claire, a woman originally from the French Caribbean who had built her own criminal empire. She was known as Queenie, and she was feared and respected in equal measure. Street Claire refused to submit to the Italian Mafia when they began moving into Harlem in the early 1930s. She fought back with intelligence, legal maneuvering, and when necessary, violence. Bumpy Johnson became one of her most trusted enforcers. By the mid-1930s, the Mafia's expansion into Harlem was well underway. Figures like Dutch Schultz and later Lucky Luciano wanted control of the numbers racket because it was stable, profitable, and relatively low risk compared to bootlegging, which was ending with the repeal of prohibition. The Italian crime families had power, organization, and political protection. They believed Harlem was theirs for the taking. But Harlem's black operators were not willing to surrender without a fight. Street, Claire, and Johnson understood that outright war with the Mafia would be devastating. The Mafia had more guns, more money, and more allies in law enforcement. Direct conflict would end badly. But that did not mean submission. It meant strategy. The rules of engagement between black criminal groups and the Italian Mafia were unwritten but clearly understood. The Mafia could move into Harlem, but they had to negotiate. They had to share profits. They could not simply take everything. More importantly, they had to show a degree of respect, at least in public. Disrespect was dangerous because it undermined authority. In a world where reputation determined survival, public humiliation could not be ignored. This is where the incident occurred. The exact date is not documented with precision, but credible accounts place it in the mid to late 1930s, during the height of Mafia encroachment into Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was meeting with a mid-level Italian mobster in a public setting, likely a bar or social club where others could see and hear. The meeting was supposed to be a negotiation, a discussion about territory or payments. These kinds of meetings happened regularly. They were tense but usually civil. During this meeting, the Italian mobster became frustrated. Perhaps he felt Johnson was not being cooperative. Perhaps he believed Johnson needed to be reminded of his place. Whatever the reason, the mobster insulted Johnson publicly, using a racial slur. He did not say it quietly or privately. He said it loud enough for others to hear. This was not just an insult. It was a challenge. In the logic of organized crime, public disrespect demands a response. If Johnson walked away without reacting, he would be seen as weak. His authority would collapse. Other criminals, both black and Italian, would assume he could be pushed around. His protection rackets, his control over numbers runners, his standing with street Claire, all of it depended on the perception that he could not be disrespected without consequence. The racial slur itself carried weight far beyond the word. In the 1930s, racial violence was commonplace. Lynchings were still happening in the South. Black Americans were denied basic rights, subjected to segregation, and treated as second-class citizens in every aspect of life. In the criminal underworld, these same dynamics played out. The Italian Mafia saw themselves as superior to black criminals, not just in terms of power, but in terms of race. The slur was a reminder of that hierarchy. It was meant to humiliate, to reduce Johnson to something less than human, to put him in what the mobster believed was his proper place. But Johnson did not react immediately. He did not pull a weapon. He did not shout or threaten. He stayed calm. He looked at the mobster, said nothing, and left. To those watching, it might have looked like weakness. It was not. It was patience. Over the following days, Johnson began to move carefully. He did not retaliate with violence against the mobster directly. Instead, he started applying pressure in other ways. He disrupted mafia operations in Harlem, quietly and systematically. Numbers runners who had been cooperating with Italian collectors suddenly stopped paying. Shipments were delayed. Information stopped flowing. Small acts of interference, none of them dramatic, but all of them costly. Johnson also reached out to other black operators in Harlem. He reminded them of what had happened. He made it clear that if one Italian mobster could use a racial slur publicly without consequence, it would happen again. It would become acceptable. Other mafia figures would feel emboldened. The fragile respect that black criminals had earned would disappear. This was not just about Johnson's personal pride. It was about maintaining boundaries that protected everyone. At the same time, Johnson made it known, through intermediaries, what had happened. He ensured that other mafia figures, higher up the chain of command, understood that one of their men had publicly disrespected him. This was strategic. Johnson was not appealing to their sense of fairness. He was pointing out a problem. If the mafia allowed one of their own to publicly humiliate a black operator without consequence, it would encourage others to do the same. That would destabilize the fragile balance of power in Harlem. It would lead to conflict, and conflict would hurt profits. The mafia leadership understood this. They did not care about Johnson's dignity. They cared about money and stability. The mobster who had insulted Johnson had acted recklessly. He had created a problem that now needed to be solved. The mafia could crush Johnson with force if they wanted to, but force would come at a cost. It would mean open war in Harlem. It would mean police attention. It would mean disruption to their cash flow from the numbers racket. It would mean uncertainty, and uncertainty was bad for business. What happened next was a negotiation, not a war. Mafia representatives reached out to Johnson. They did not apologize, but they made it clear that the insult had been unauthorized. They indicated, subtly, that the mobster in question would be dealt with internally. He was reassigned, demoted, or removed from operations in Harlem. The exact punishment is not documented, but the message was clear. The insult would not be repeated. Johnson's authority would be respected. This resolution was significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that the mafia was willing to adjust its behavior when it served their interests. They were not invincible, and they were not above negotiation. Second, it showed that Johnson understood power better than many of his contemporaries. He did not need to kill the mobster to restore his reputation. He needed to make the situation costly for the mafia, and then offer them a way to resolve it without further loss. That required intelligence and restraint. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it revealed the limits of racial hierarchy in organized crime. The Mafia believed they were superior, and in many ways, they had more power. But in Harlem, they needed cooperation. They needed local operators who understood the community, who had relationships with residents, who could move through the neighborhood without drawing attention. Johnson provided that. Disrespecting him weakened their position, and they realized it. The incident also demonstrated something crucial about how fear operates in criminal organizations. Violence creates immediate fear, but it fades quickly. People become numb to it. They expect it. But uncertainty creates lasting fear. When someone responds to disrespect with measured, strategic action rather than immediate violence, it becomes harder to predict their next move. That unpredictability forces others to be cautious. They cannot simply overpower you with force because they do not know what else you might do, who else you might involve, or how far you are willing to escalate. After this incident, Johnson's reputation grew. He was known not just as an enforcer, but as someone who could navigate complex political terrain. He could fight when necessary, but he preferred to win without fighting. That made him more dangerous, not less. People who rely only on violence are predictable. Johnson was not predictable. He could be patient. He could wait. He could calculate. That uncertainty made others cautious. Johnson continued working with Stephanie Street Clare until her eventual retirement from active criminal operations in the late 1930s. After that, he aligned himself more closely with other Harlem operators and eventually formed a working relationship with the Italian Mafia, particularly with the Genovese crime family. This relationship was pragmatic. Johnson maintained control over certain operations in Harlem, and the Mafia took a percentage. It was not friendship, it was business. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Johnson became one of the most influential figures in Harlem's underworld. He was involved in drug trafficking, gambling, and extortion. He spent time in prison, including a lengthy sentence in the 1950s for drug conspiracy, but his reputation remained intact. When he was released in 1963, he returned to Harlem and resumed his role, though the landscape of organized crime was changing. The Italian Mafia's dominance was declining, and new groups were rising. Johnson died in 1968 of a heart attack. He collapsed in a restaurant in Harlem, still active in criminal operations until the end. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a mix of criminals, community members, and those who had known him for decades. He was remembered as someone who had survived in a brutal world by being smarter and more patient than most. The incident with the Italian mobster is not the most dramatic story in Bumpy Johnson's life. There were shootings, betrayals, prison sentences, and power struggles that involved far more violence. But this incident reveals something important about how power actually works in criminal organizations. Violence is common. It is expected. But violence alone does not build lasting authority. What builds authority is the ability to control situations, to know when to act and when to wait, and to force others to respect boundaries without destroying everything in the process. The Mafia backed down not because they feared Johnson would kill the mobster who insulted him. They backed down because Johnson made it clear that disrespect would be expensive. He disrupted their operations. He involved higher-ranking members. He created a situation where resolving the problem peacefully was easier than allowing it to escalate. That is not the work of a hothead. It is the work of someone who understands leverage. This approach also reflects the reality of race and power in American organized crime during the 20th century. Black criminals operated in a system that was stacked against them. They had fewer resources, less political protection, and were subject to harsher law enforcement. The Italian Mafia had institutional advantages that black operators could not match. But within Harlem, black operators had knowledge, relationships, and community trust that the Mafia needed. That gave them a degree of power, and figures like Johnson learned how to use that power effectively. The lesson of this incident is not that Bumpy Johnson was a hero. He was a criminal who hurt people, sold drugs, and contributed to the suffering of his own community. But within the brutal logic of organized crime, he was effective. He understood that fear built on restraint lasts longer than fear built on constant violence. People who kill at the first insult become predictable. People who wait, who calculate, who respond strategically, those people are harder to read. That uncertainty creates fear. This is why the incident mattered. It was not about one insult. It was about establishing a pattern. Johnson showed that he could not be disrespected publicly without consequence, but he also showed that he would not overreact. That balance made him someone the Mafia had to take seriously. They could not dismiss him, and they could not easily intimidate him. That forced them to negotiate, and negotiation meant recognizing his authority. In the decades since Johnson's death, his story has been mythologized. Films, television shows, and books have turned him into a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against oppression. Some of that mythology is deserved. He did resist the Mafia's attempts to dominate Harlem completely. He did maintain a degree of independence in a system designed to crush it, but the mythology often obscures the reality. Johnson was not fighting for justice. He was fighting for control. His resistance was not moral, it was strategic. The incident with the racial slur is a reminder that even in a world defined by violence, the most dangerous people are often the ones who know when not to use it. Johnson could have killed the mobster. He probably wanted to, but he understood that killing him would have started a war, and a war would have destroyed everything he had built. Instead, he turned the insult into a problem for the Mafia, forced them to acknowledge it, and extracted a resolution that strengthened his position. That is power. What this incident reveals, ultimately, is that power in criminal organizations is not just about who can inflict the most violence. It is about who can control the situation, who can set the terms, and who can make others respect boundaries without burning everything down. Bumpy Johnson understood that. The Italian Mafia learned it. And Harlem remembered it long after he was gone.